Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to people across Canada and internationally. We're delighted to have you with us today for the second of our webinars dealing with the Pope's visit and the efforts at reconciliation. We call this the journey ahead, the next step for reconciliation after the Papal visit. My name is Ken Coates. I'm a Canada Research Chair at the University of Saskatchewan, and I'm a fellow of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Delighted to be with you today. We're joined today by two people, and hopefully by three. We're trying to sort of make connections. But Michael Higgins, who's a distinguished professor of Catholic thought emeritus from Sacred Heart University in Connecticut, is with us. Melissa Mbarki, my colleague at Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a policy analyst and outreach coordinator. And we're hoping that Chief Cadmus DeLorme of the Cowessess First Nation will be able to join us as well. As you may recall, those who were able to join us on the first webinar, we explored the whole question of why was the Pope coming, what were people expecting, what were their hopes and expectations, were they reasonable? Did we legitimately expect the Pope would be able to meet all of the challenges and demands, sort of placed on him as he came to this country? The events themselves went off with grace. They went off with grace. Grace on the part of the Pope, grace certainly on the part of Indigenous peoples, particularly residential school survivors, great dignity among all the audiences that he addressed and the people who surrounded him. So what I'm going to do is start this off by asking our panelists, Melissa and Michael, in the first instance here, to just tell us their thoughts. I mean, what was it like? Did you actually meet your expectations? Melissa, you were in the middle of all of this. How did it go?
I thought the Pope delivered on his apology. That's what he came to Canada for. That's what his visit specifically was for. And, he delivered that to survivors who were in the crowd. And you could have heard a pin drop before he apologized. And it literally took the words out of me. I could not express how I felt in that moment because, I was feeling the emotions with everybody in the crowd. And it was quite something to hear because a lot of people waited for this apology. People waited decades to hear this apology. So it was heartfelt, it was sincere. It was, he spoke the words that survivors wanted to hear. And for many, this potentially was closure for them, acknowledging the abuse that they had gone through. This was a closure, for their time spent in residential schools. It was very impactful. My grandmother was a survivor of a residential school, and I took that apology for her. I accepted it, I welcomed it because that's our only way forward is to heal and to learn and to, you know, learn from this whole experience, not only just survivors, but Canada in general, and to know that, what, we're on the road to reconciliation, and this is a start of it.
I'm glad you said the start of it. I don't think anybody expected this was the end of the path to reconciliation, but a good start. And I remember doing interviews in the 1980s with Roman Catholic priests who've been involved in residential schools in Yukon, and it was really interesting how incredibly defensive he was. People were criticizing the residential schools. He's no, they're wrong. These were great things. They were wonderful. We did all this great work for the children, and to see how far we've come. That's 30 years, and in the broad sweep of history, 30 years is relatively fast. So thank you very much, Melissa. I appreciate that. Michael, to you.
I'm going to do something a little different this time, Ken. Something I ordinarily wouldn't do in a webinar or a situation like this, and that actually read a couple of paragraphs from an article, a column that I was commissioned to write for a British journal that has a large international readership. They wanted to know something about what was happening in Canada with the Pope. And so I wrote this, and then rereading it the other day, I realized I don't think I could say it better than what I had actually written. So I won't read the whole column, don't worry, it's just a few minutes of it. But I think it speaks directly to how I understood the visit and the inevitable consequences. In quoting Charles Taylor on secularization, Pope Francis noted that it represents a challenge for our pastoral imagination. an occasion for restructuring the spiritual life in new forms and new ways of existing. In applying this bold exercise to pastoral imagination in the Canadian context, and interestingly, Francis actually quoted a Canadian in relation to this. Indeed, in the New World context, Francis is calling for nothing less than a spiritual revolution. How do we address the corrosive effects of colonization, the deliberate and systematic effort to eradicate the cultures and spiritualities of the first peoples, the appalling record of Eurocentric hegemony, with its presumed civilizational superiority, in a way that moves beyond theory, exhortatory rhetoric, and deft spiritual maneuvering? Well, the theologian Frederick Bauer-Schmidt concisely encapsulates the options this way. Christians, and I quote, must take as their role model not Sepulveda, the Spanish Renaissance humanist who argued in favor of the slavery of indigenous peoples and who justified the conversion by conquest of the Americas, but rather the martyred Trappist monks of Tiberin in Algeria, who died because they would not abandon their Muslim neighbors, end of quote. Now, the option, in other words, is either aggressive proselytizing or authentic witness. Well, for centuries, we chose the former, and the consequences are clear. We're living with them now. Francis repeatedly calls for the recognition of the special genius of the indigenous peoples, their harmony with creation, the richness of their many languages, which we ruthlessly suppressed, and the paramount need to move through truth to reconciliation, and then, and only then, forgiveness. For me, the most telling and effective moments that spoke to the pastoral instincts of the Pope were his kissing of the hand of an elder and his return of a pair of child's moccasins to a former chief, as he had promised when he first received them last spring in Rome. Tactile moments, moments of embrace, gestures of conversion. Now, for sure, the political squabbling and ecclesial debates in the background often moved to the foreground, but Francis relished the personal encounter over the ideological jostling and the political posturing. And, of course, once freed from the script and protocol, he spoke his mind freely on the plane back to Rome, conceding that indeed what happened to the indigenous peoples was genocide, and that the controverted, and I mean controverted, not just controversial, doctrine of discovery reflects a colonial mentality that must be repudiated. His critics in the end got what he wanted, but they got what he wanted on his terms. The pilgrimage of penance would not be compromised. The personal encounter would be prioritized. The deepest empathy assured. Reverencing the other was his imperative. So that's my opening remarks, and I thought that I said them most succinctly there. I never say anything succinctly, as you know, Ken, but that's as compressed as it gets.
Well, that was beautiful, actually, Michael, and very, very thoughtful, and a thoughtful exploration of a very thoughtful visit, actually. I think people sort of my view of this is that people sort of expected the Pope to behave in sort of small p political terms, to use sort of the language of apology, the language of compensation, the language of sort of technical reconciliation. You've highlighted something I'm going to ask you about quickly, and I should just mention to our viewers that Chief Delorme will be joining us shortly. So, Michael, I'll turn this question to you, and your comments here reflect this very, very nicely. The Pope's visit was a Catholic event. But a lot of the comments, a lot of the critiques were sort of evaluating it as though it was an official or a state visit. And I guess I'm wondering about the Catholicism of it all. Because it seems to me that that's a really important part of this visit, and this was a Pope visiting his own flock, visiting his own congregations, not just Canada, and not just survivors of residential schools, but the Catholic Church in Canada. Can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. Because the Vatican is a sovereign power, a political state, and because it has ambassadors all over the world, in probably more countries than most political jurisdictions. And it's been at this business for a very long time. And Canada has its ambassador to the Holy See, separate from its ambassador to Italy itself, the Quirinale. So they have an ambassador to the Quirinale and they have a Vatican to the ambassador to the Vatican. Everything the Pope does has a political flavoring at some point. And when he comes to a country like he did to Canada, it was not primarily a state visit, but the Prime Minister shows up, the Governor General shows up. He's not giving an address to Parliament, and he specifically was identifying unique areas in which he was talking to Indigenous constituents, survivors of residential schools, and Catholic leaders. That is true. And so in some way, it's a kind of a mishmash here, because when Pope Francis went to the United States at the invitation of the American government, he gave an address to both houses of Congress. And he highlighted 4 specific figures in American history, 2 of them Catholic, 2 of them non-Catholic, that were shapers of the moral sensibility of the country. When Benedict went to Britain, he spoke to in Parliament. So those are very specifically political colored events. This wasn't, but the political coloration was still there, but it was more on the margins. It was primarily a pastoral visit, what he called a pilgrimage of penance. So it had a penitential component to it, and it was specifically designed to effect healing, or at least the beginning of the healing process. And very important to understand, he came as a consequence of an invitation that originated in the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action, number 58. Yeah, it took a while for the Rome to act on that, but I don't blame Rome really for this. I think that the tardiness or the dilatoriness of this was basically more Canadian than it was Roman. But nonetheless, he came as a response of their request. Now, the Canadian bishops, of course, formalized that invitation. The Prime Minister had asked him before to come, but this occasion was in so many ways pastoral as well as political, and that's where the jostling comes. Those who wanted to turn it entirely political were defeated. But at the same time, if it had been only pastoral, only to Canadian Catholics, it would have been delimiting. So really, if you put it within the context of a spiritual pilgrimage of penance, then it's really for the nation to observe.
Yes, thanks, Michael. And we're going to have Chief Delorme with us shortly, but I'm going to, Melissa, draw you in again if you don't mind. We've talked about the Pope's visit from the time it was first announced, and actually we had conversations going back to when the Indigenous folks were even planning going over to Rome. You had personally had really high expectations. So I'm just really interested in what this meant to you personally. You talked about that a little bit, about accepting the apology on behalf of your grandmother, but also the second part about you said that this was a start. The start of what? What's it the start of?
I think in order for us to move forward, we needed to hear that apology. We needed to hear it from the federal government. We needed to hear it from the church. We needed to hear it from the people who were involved in residential schools. One of the things prior to the apology, I tried to go in with no expectations. I really didn't want to say, you know what, this is what he should say, and this is how we should interpret it. What he did do, and what I was, quite happy for, was he acknowledged the assimilation of these schools. That's exactly what they were. Like, they weren't there for education. They weren't there to, ensure these kids got to a grade 12. They were there to take away culture, language. They were there to assimilate. And having recognized that is a huge step in reconciliation, because these are no longer classified as just educational institutions, because they weren't. My stepdad was in a residential school, and he came out with a grade 6 level of education, and he had to go back and work hard to get his grade 12. My grandmother was able to make it to a grade 12. So there are a lot of, things that these schools weren't and that they were. And now we're picking up pieces in our communities in terms of language, culture. We're trying to give these back to our people. And, it is a step in that, because they acknowledge that it was taken. Like, these very basic core identity things that, shape us as people, they were taken from us at young ages. And, it's definitely acknowledging that, dark part of our history is a first step. Now the next thing is, how do we move forward? What are the next steps, and how do we get there?
So we're going to talk about that in much of the rest of where we go. But I'd like to welcome Chief Cadmus-Delorme. Chief, thanks very, very much for joining us. And those of you who've been on our seminars and webinars before will know that Chief Delorme is the chief of a community that is setting sort of a new pathway in Western Canada and across the country for sort of community empowerment and embracing the future. I watch with admiration what the chief is doing on a regular basis, and you found yourself, chief, in the middle of this conversation over the question of the graveyards near the site of the former residential school. So let me put you on the spot and just ask you to tell us what you thought of the Pope's visit. At the end of the day, were you satisfied with what happened? How was it received in your community? I'm delighted to hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Ken, and good afternoon, everybody, or good day, wherever you're listening from. On last Monday on Cowes, that there was a Roman Catholic residential school on Cowes from 1898 to 1996. The doors closed, but the Roman Catholic Church left in 1974, and Indian Affairs took over it then. We had ceremony. We had it live streamed at our hall. There was both Cowes citizens, residential school survivors, and some Roman Catholic faith goers from the local communities that come and join. And then we had a powwow to song, dance, just to make sure we create an environment and how it was triggering. My thoughts to the day, to the words that were spoken. I just want to educate everybody on what number 58 of the Truth and Reconciliation says. It says, for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. I did not hear that. So to say that, and I'm not trying to be critical of the Pope, but when we say that number 58 was fulfilled, there was a missed opportunity there in regards to what number 58 of the Truth and Reconciliation, the intent was that, to accept of the responsibility. And, I give credit there that that to accept the responsibility, but there was a deep hole left in the acknowledgement of the full role the church played in the system. And so, in conclusion, um, it's after the fact. Canada, Saskatchewan, where I am, we have to understand that we're all changing our attitudes and adjusting our thoughts to what reconciliation truly means, so that our children and children yet unborn can have a brighter future. So we got to feed off of the journey. So Ken, I'll leave my comments there.
Oh, well, you've left some phenomenal comments on the table, Chief, and just to sort of really quickly sort of not push back at you, but to sort of ask a little bit more deeply about what you've said. Um, it makes it sound like the community's response was less than overwhelming, less than enthusiastic, but sort of a bit disappointed. Is that a fair observation?
Thanks, Ken. I'm not a residential school survivor. As the chief of a First Nation, my role in leadership's role is to provide a safe environment for our survivors on each of their individual journey of healing and what they have endured and so resilient today. And there was mixed feelings that day. Some didn't come, some stayed home. They just didn't want to be around people that day. Some came, some took in the whole day. They accepted it. I had one person walk out of the live stream when the headdress was presented. And so you just had a whole it's not one feeling. It's the realization that each survivor is on their healing journey, and family of survivor. That day was for Canada to now know that our action is when the Pope leaves now. The words were spoken, action now must come next. And so the feelings were mixed that day.
Okay. And understandably so. And Chief, you make a good point that not only is that every survivor's individual journey, it's every survivor's individual history. Their experience of residential school varied enormously in terms of the kinds of abuse and violence and discrimination that they faced, and sometimes also some love and affection and some guidance, but a real mixed bag to say the very least. So, Michael, if you don't mind me going back to you quickly, and then we're going to go. We got a whole bunch of questions from people who are signing up for the webinar, and I would encourage those of you who are watching online to feel free to send in additional ones, and we'll try to squeeze them in. But Michael, you talked about a revolution. And I watched the events very closely. I watched the commentary very closely. You see that the ground has shifted, that the earth has shaken, that the storm has hit, that the world has been turned into a new path. I heard a bunch of people saying, well, much ado about nothing. That really wasn't as what we expected, or we wanted more of this and less of that. But I'm going to take you at your word. You know the church very, very well. So what is this revolution, and what is the new direction that the church is going to be heading on?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to recognize that Pope Francis is a Jesuit, and the Jesuits think subtly, and they think in long terms, and they think in deep terms. And my sense is that what Francis was doing was in part what he drew from that passage I quoted from Charles Taylor, which he lifted from the Secular Age in his address in the Basilica, also quoting from Bernard Lonergan, one of the great foundational thinkers in Canadian history. So he was situating himself within the Canadian context by using those two particular pillars of Canadian Catholic thought, but not just Canadian Catholic thought, Canadian thought period. And what he was also doing was, I think, what he has been doing in Rome as Pope with what we call in ecclesial terms, synodality. He's changing the way the church operates, its modus operandi, if you like. He's changing the way in which the church relates to the world. Now, when you got 1 billion people in your community, that's not the easiest ship to turn around. And you have thousands of middle managers or bishops who basically run these individual entities throughout the Catholic world. But beginning the change, beginning to move toward a more humble church, to begin to recognize the importance of living co-sympathetically and co-creatively with other jurisdictions, faiths, and cultures is a primary component of Pope Francis's efforts to bring the Roman Catholic Church back to its new agenda of change, which was ushered in 1962. I think I said at the last webinar that we had that Bergoglio, Pope Francis, is continuing the tradition that abruptly ended in 1963 with the death of Giuseppe Roncalli, John the 23rd. So you're going back and re-energizing a view of the church that's rather different structurally from the Roman Catholic Church that we have seen during the pontificates, particularly of John Paul II and of Benedict XVI. So when we're talking about a spiritual revolution, we're not talking about something that deals exclusively with structures. In fact, it primarily deals with a conversion of the heart. And so what he understands is if we're going to move toward genuine reconciliation and forgiveness and healing, there must be a conversion in the heart. There must be a way of moving beyond the way we have perceived things. You got to remember that although of Italian origin, he's an Argentinian. He knows the history of the ravages of the conquistadors in Latin America. He's not unaware of this. And in his address in Aparecida in Brazil, he talked very specifically about the struggles of indigenous peoples, which he has before. So addressing the plight of indigenous peoples who have been marginalized and abused, it is not unique to this pontiff. I mean, as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, as the head of the Latin American bishops, CELAM, he's been active in a lot of these discussions for some time. So for me, the spiritual revolution is a revolution that is ushered in. It'll take time. I mean, we're talking the Roman Catholic Church here. This is a huge global institution, sometimes ossified, sometimes atrophied, sometimes energized, and he is only the Bishop of Rome. But so often, as our indigenous friends have indicated, sometimes these things start with the Bishop of Rome. They just don't end with the Bishop of Rome.
Good point, actually, Michael. Thanks very much. And we have a couple of questions that came, one from Stephen and Shelby, and I'm going to sort of put them together. And Stephen sort of asked, do Indigenous people see this as a successful visit? It sort of meet their general expectation. Shelby makes it a little bit more precise and Melissa, I'm going to ask this question to you first, if you don't mind, about what do you as an Indigenous person hope to see come out of this event? And what are your personal hopes for steps forward? So this has happened, and part of me as an historian, and Michael certainly picks up on this. This is a massive historical event. It's one we'll be talking about 100 years from now. That's fantastic. But pragmatically, Melissa, what do you expect to happen next?
I never thought I would see the apology in my lifetime, to be honest. I just didn't think this was something that was going to happen. I didn't think it was something that I was going to hear. And what I do hope is that it shifts our communities. It shifts us into a more healthy path forward. I do hope to see more resources for survivors today. Some of the youngest survivors are my age. I went to school with them. I see them struggle every day. When I go back to my home community, I am looking at, just what they face. And one of my biggest hopes is that, we have resources to help them. These are the people who need it. These are the communities who need they need help in all kinds of ways, whether we need facilities for the youth, for the elders. This is what I want to see for my community: a positive pathway forward, the church, the government, Indigenous people, Indigenous communities working together to make this happen. And that's my long-term goal, and that's always been my goal, to see my people thrive and to see them make their way out of this. And I just hope to see a better future for the children that come after me and for the generations that come after.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. Chief, a somewhat different question that came in from one of our listeners as well is, we've known about what happened in residential schools for a long time. In your communities, it's been known about for generations. The word started to get out in the 1960s and 1970s. It became a crescendo and then a loud scream in the 1980s and 90s. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's nothing new about what the Pope said. It wasn't as though he was admitting to a deep, dark secret. He was talking about something that we knew about for a very, very long time. In your community, where you're responding to so many forces and influences that are, economic and social and environmental and whatever, where does reconciliation with the Catholic Church and the Catholics generally fit in your community priorities?
Thank you. Cowessess First Nation, we are a nation and community of good neighbor mentality. And we had a church on Cowessess in up to 2019. It was on Cowessess. It was a part of the Roman Catholic Church. It burnt down. I just want to explain to you what the response was. That morning, it burnt down in the middle of the night. That morning, I got there at about 7:45 a.m. It was nothing but just a cement hole. And one car would pull up, and someone would pop their head out of the window. It was winter time. It was kind of cold. They're like, it couldn't have burnt down any sooner, and they just drive away. The next one would pull up and say, oh, that's the last memory I have of my mom and dad getting married in there. And these are elderly people today. And why I start off with that is the church's role in the Maryville Residential School, it varies. And so, what is our strategic direction today? Our strategic direction is to help Cowessess citizens find a peace in their heart, in the rest of their days, so that their kitchen tables, when they're talking with their kids and grandkids today, can have an inner peace. Some, want more Roman Catholic relationship. When we have our events, maybe the local priest will come. Some don't want a Catholic person on Causes. And so what is our strategic direction is to make sure our kitchen tables are not adding on to the intergenerational trauma, and that we got to understand faith is needed in every home, prayer is needed in every home. And so it's just the challenge in that is how to balance the mixed emotions, because forgiveness is a commitment. It's in the feelings is what we have to manage and balance, and I mean that in a strategic minded way. So the more we can have open areas for people to talk truthfully, I do believe the more strategically the church can play a role in the future when it comes to kitchen tables, to make sure that every home has faith. If that's spirituality or religion, we don't judge, as long as every kitchen table has a faith. And so that is the challenge and the strategy moving forward.
Yeah. Well, and great answer. I always struggle with the reality. My view basically is that if you look at truth and reconciliation, an awful lot of the effort has gone into focusing on the non-Indigenous people. What do you have to learn? How do you have to behave? Whether it's land recognitions, acknowledgements, or other things of that nature, and not so much on what non-Indigenous people can do responding to the Pope's challenge, not just Catholics, to actually help your communities, Melissa and Chief. I mean, you've talked about something that worries me. That's a lot of pain. Those are a lot of difficulties. Those are hard memories to get rid of and to overcome. And I love your emphasis, both of you having this in different ways, on peace, of finding a tranquility or finding sort of a comfortable place to be in the world. I'm really interested in what both of you think. Maybe I'll start you first, Melissa, and then go back to the Chief. What should non-Indigenous people be doing in response to this acknowledgement? This acknowledgement is basically an indictment of one of the most fundamental pillars of Canadian policy for over a century. So, should we all apologize? Can we do something practical? So, Melissa, what's your thought?
I think, Canadians can listen to our stories and, be empathetic with us. We're not asking for judgment. We're not asking for you to agree with us. We're not asking for opinions on how we should be, how we should react to this apology. Because even today, it's been a little over 2 weeks. We still have survivors that are still processing that, and they're still going through the motions of what was just, what just went on, and they're still processing that internally, because it does bring up a lot of memories, and it does bring up a lot of hard feelings towards the church. So, just allowing us to go through those motions, and allowing us to, when we're ready and when survivors are ready, to just speak their truth and to be able to share with the country what their experience was. And sometimes I find we're not doing that. We sometimes I find we need to have a hard answer today on what we thought of the Pope coming to Canada, even prior to the apology. Well, let us process that. Let us, internalize it. Let us, get our thoughts together, and we'll share with you what we took from it. And I think there needs to be more empathy out there, especially in the coming years. We still have communities that are searching their grounds for children. We need to be mindful of them, and just speak with kindness to others. And if we can do that, this world would be a lot better place.
Thanks, Melissa. Chief, do you want to add to what Melissa had to say?
Thanks, Ken, and well said, Melissa. I just to add on, the unmarked graves that have been going on and still yet to come in this country. I learned two things. I'm a proud Indigenous person. I'm a proud Saskatchewanian. I'm a proud Canadian. There's two things I learned. One, for Indigenous people, the unmarked graves validation is validation on the pain, frustration, anger, and tiredness of trying to remain Indigenous in a country that is still somewhat oppressive to Indigenous people. To my Canadian friends and family, the shield is down, admitting I don't know much about the truth between Indigenous people and Canada. Like, where we're at right now in our relationship is truth. We got to understand that what we always thought is really not the truth. And so we have to really focus on adjusting our compass just a little bit. And it's on both sides. It's on both the Indigenous and the non-Indigenous. It's not just the one side. Secondly, Indigenous people are rights holders in this country. We're not shareholders, we're not stakeholders, we're rights holders. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that. And then lastly, quit making us so political in this country. You know, we're not just Section 91 or 92 of this Canadian Constitution. We have a key role. And once we get it, I tell you, this country in faith, economic, and social would be so much in a better place. But it all begins with truth. We got to go through a journey of creating uncomfortable conversations, because that's what reconciliation is. To first, we have to accept the truth. Then we all got to realize we inherited something and we have a responsibility to do something about it. It's not just for us to acknowledge it and say, get over it, that's the past. No, we all have a responsibility to do something on what we inherited.
So, Chief, powerful words from both of you, really, really evocative. And I always think of residential schools, you know, started closed down in the 1960s and 1970s. And for a lot of people, not for Michael and myself, the old guys in the room, but for younger people, that's sort of before their lives, right? And I worry about that sort of, well, that happened a long time ago. What both of you are talking about is the fact that this, don't call it residential schools, call it assimilation, oppression, call it those other things, are current realities of Indigenous people. And we're breaking the mold in some really interesting ways. What your community is doing at Cowessess is turning the world on its head in some fascinating ways. Modern treaties in the Yukon are doing amazing things. When the Micmac and Maliseet buy the largest seafood company in Canada, and bring it under Indigenous control. When you've got billion-dollar projects being run by First Nations in British Columbia and in Vancouver, you know, the world is changing, and we should celebrate all those as part of a sort of a new path, and build those ones into sort of the new truth and reconciliation, right? And I, you know, Chief, I say this, you know, sort of directly and personally, you know, friendship is the most important part of reconciliation. In my view, when you get past this point of seeing people as a political entity, and you see them as your friends and colleagues and your co-citizens of the country, and I think this rights holder piece that you're talking about is really vital. You know, you're not here on sufferance, and you don't get government things because government's being generous to you. You know, that part's really critical. So Michael, because you got the easy questions before. And then you've had some wonderful responses from Chief and Melissa. This is from Father Andrew. Asked a question: a majority of Indigenous Canadians are faithful Christians. How do you ensure that their experience of Christian faith is heard within these elite conversations, which seems to see this reality as sort of an inconvenient truth? Many Indigenous people are faithful Christians. I think that's an unchallengeable statement, but it isn't one that fits with how non-Indigenous Canadians prefer to see what's going on, even with the Church's apology. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
Yes, I was struck by a comment made by an Indigenous priest on the CBC, who was quite disturbed by the fact that the Church had missed the opportunity of incorporating many Indigenous rituals into the Catholic celebrations and liturgies that occurred during the Papal Visit. And I think that that's a justified criticism. It is one thing, you know, to profess the value of enculturation, to recognize the importance of the limitations of the traditional Eurocentric catechesis, and all this kind of thing. We know the consequences of many of these things. What is important is to be able to enter into authentic communication and dialogue with Indigenous cultures and spiritualities. And I put it in the plural because it is as much a mistake to talk about indigenous culture and spirituality as if it was a hegemonic, unified, monolithic reality, as it is to talk about the Catholic Church in the same way. Many Catholic leaders, particularly at the level of, for instance, the Society of Jesus, the original Black Robes, but the Sisters of St. Anne and others have broken out of the pattern of the past and have for several decades, in the realization that to move forward means to recognize that the way things were done were inadequate and sometimes destructive. And how does one move forward then, but if not by bringing into the conversation a level of authenticity and hearing that doesn't operate from the point of view of some kind of civilizational supremacy. We know what's best. We know how we can move forward. We don't really need to listen because we don't have anything that we need to learn. I want to give you an example of sometimes what happens when this kind of attitude becomes encrusted in structures. Many years ago, we had a major conference on global communication in the Vatican. Actually, it was in the City Hall in Rome. And there were a number of luminaries. And I was sitting beside Marshall McLuhan's son, Eric. Eric was giving an address. Marshall McLuhan was a convert to Catholicism. And Eric has continued the tradition of his father and his work. And the church wanted to know about globalization from the point of view of this great media figure, one of the great men of media genius of the last century. So I was sitting beside, as I say, between Eric and his wife, and when as is typical of the Roman system, you have introductions, you have all these prelates, archbishops, cardinals, dicasterio heads, and everything else. And then when Eric got up to speak, many of the principals got off the dais and they left. And she turned to me horrified, and she said, "What's this level of discourtesy?" And I said, "No, they don't consider it discourteous. They just don't feel that they have anything to learn. And so that's why they leave." Well, leaving the dais, leaving the room, leaving the table is not become an option under Pope Francis. You stay at the table. And if you look at the record of his meetings and his audiences and his conversations with various people throughout the world in Rome, and sometimes bringing forward very strong, deep concerns, he sits and he listens. He doesn't get up. He doesn't, and this is unusual for a pontiff, he doesn't pontificate. He actually listens to them. There are numerous instances when we've had this on record. And so when I was talking about a spiritual revolution earlier, I wasn't being glib. I think that's what we have at hand. And you got to remember that for many of us, and for many in the church in Canada, the Catholic Church, but other churches as well, we've lived a life of quiescent somnolescence. I mean, we just sleep through our relatively pacific and uncomplicated history. And we look sometimes with superiority at other civilizations and say, look how riven they are, the US in particular. The discovery or the realization that we have at the heart of our early history, genocidal policy, that's really quite shattering thing to discover. And the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the other work that's been going on for decades, it made a strong, important, cumulative, gradualist approach, but it took the discovery of the unmarked graves to actually make it a national moment, in fact, an international moment as far as the media was concerned. I think the Papal Visit is not unlike that. Yes, we know a great number of these things, but what do we do? What did Francis do to help to crystallize a new knowledge, to help us find a new way of moving forward that is not political or designed basically to placate or to mitigate, but actually to essentially reform and to rethink the way we've been thinking? And you see, that's really to ask of an institution, particularly an institution of 2,000 years vintage, is a tough challenge. But it's far less a challenge, much more meaningful for individual Catholics to be able to incorporate it in their lives to begin the change. Pope Francis, I'll end the comment with this. Pope Francis has made it absolutely clear that as an ecclesiological image, the notion of the church as a pyramid is over. The pyramid is upside down. The Pope isn't at the top, he's at the bottom with the leadership. Now, that shift in an image means that a great deal of responsibility is now going to have to be accepted by faithful Catholics at important levels of operation. But it also means they have to be given responsibility and power for accountability. You can't just do this as a political gesture. You have to be intentional about what you want to achieve.
Wow. No, I mean, that is really important, Michael, to help us sort of understand the long-term spiritual significance and organizational significance of these things. You know, the words on the page are one thing, but the significance behind them are something very, very different. So Melissa, if one of the things that commentators said about the Pope's visit is they were disappointed by the absence of specific commitments. The Pope didn't come and say, "Oh, we're going to honor our financial commitment that we made, or we're going to deliver the documents back from the Vatican and make them available in Canada to the communities, or we're going to take the artifacts out of some of the Vatican museums and make them available to folks in back in the countries and back in their own communities." So John asked a question about this. So what's your thought on this? I mean, should the Pope have made more specific things, or was this a time to really listen to the deep meaning that Michael's been talking about?
I was kind of hoping that we would have more substance to the apology. Like, I was hoping at the end of the day, we'd have some action items from the church and from the Pope to say, okay, we're going to start releasing some of your artifacts back to your communities. And this is how we're going to go about doing it. Or we're going to help your communities in this way, whether we need, programs for youth, elders, the community as a whole. There was definitely nothing substantial to say, okay, this is going to happen in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years. There was nothing of that sort. So then I had to question, did he come here just for the apology first? And is this work going to happen after? And if so, that's something that we need to start working on today to say, okay, a year from now, this is what's going to happen. 5 years from now, this is what we want to see happen. I think for communities that, had residential schools or communities that were impacted by residential schools, it fell short on that front. It didn't give us anything to work with. And if it was just the apology that he came for, then that should have been clear from the beginning. Like, the Pope is just coming to apologize. Everything else is going to get worked out after the fact. And it's been 2 weeks. We still really haven't heard a whole lot of what the next steps are. And I'm just waiting for that. I'm waiting to see how we're actually going to implement, this apology into our communities and what kind of work is ahead of us.
Yes, very fair questions. So, Chief, to you, what does it mean if the Pope's going to walk the walk? So, Melissa was talking about the next steps moving forward from here. I know you well enough to know you would never sort of be so bold as to tell the Pope what to do, but you can tell us what communities might like to see the Pope follow up on. 2 weeks in the history of the Catholic Church is it's a tiny spot in time. But over the next 6 months or so, I think communities do expect to see something. So what kinds of things would you hope the Roman Catholic Church would do as a follow-up to this visit?
Thanks, Ken. We got to ask ourselves, and what is the end goal for nations, for First Nations? And I don't want to exclude Métis and Inuit, but I'm just going to focus on First Nation. What is the end goal? The end goal is that we control our destiny, that we can be proud Indigenous people and share our beautiful land with Canada and be ourselves. Well, what was the role the church played to put us in this moment of where we're at? Well, the church tried to brainwash Indigenous people that the way we prayed at one time and still do today wasn't the way, that our language wasn't the language, that our vertical lineage kinship from grandma to mom to daughter to granddaughter what wasn't the way. So what can the church do now for action? What can the Pope do? Well, number one is to publicly state that doctrine of discovery, the papal bull, is not valid. It has a very colonial mindset to it, and to start to reverse it. that is very key to controlling our destiny. And, that would change the mindsets legally in this country to really make sure reconciliation really does happen. And that's a very, very bold approach. But that is really key, and that was missed. Secondly, um, regions. You got churches in every region in this country. That the Roman Catholic. It is now up to the regions to start to assess what role they play in that area, to help empower the language, to help learn more from those Indigenous nations. You can't just have one macro plan across this country. That is unreal, because everybody in this country is at a different healing journey as well. But Cowes, we got Grayson, which is just north of us. We got Roman Catholic faith goers in our region. It's now time that we come together, and the church has resources. And there's this that the church has money. And I know the church is a very, very asset rich organization. What role can the church play to make sure that I and my children could speak our language, could walk around with a braid and know the spiritual significance? The church must commit to action. It's financially, but it's also learning as well and empowering. And so hopefully that kind of gives a highlight, but we got to understand, we got to focus on the end goal of proud Indigenous people.
Well, that is a goal that we can all share, Chief, and of course, there's communities are making major steps in that way. Let me end with asking all three of you a very short answer to a very, very complicated question that Robin asked to us. What is your position regarding Pope Francis repeatedly asking for forgiveness for the abusers and their complicit enablers, some of whom are still alive, rather than promising genuine justice, accountability, and restitution to residential school survivors? It's a very thoughtful question from Robin. So, Michael, I'll ask you first, and then to Melissa, and then the Chief.
I think what the Chief commented on earlier makes a lot of sense to me, and that is remedial or healing initiative has to happen at the local level. It has to be regional accountability. I think that that's absolutely crucial in order to affect the kind of change, the kind of meaningful apology, the kind of restitution, the kind of reparation that is required. I think it's quite problematic to be expecting Rome to do this, frankly, historically and also politically. The Pope is back on the Tiber. Change in this country will happen through the leadership of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops and Roman Catholics in this country. I think it's a bit of a red herring, too, to go on about the doctrine of discovery. The historians hugely debate the legitimacy of this interpretation. We know, we have a strong chronicle by the historians, that it was abrogated in 1531 or something with Pope Paul III, talking about the original conception that appears in Alexander VI and a papal bull. Papal bulls are, and I mentioned this the last time, are abrogated all the time. The Vatican formally repudiated the document in a report that it gave to the UN through its permanent mission in 2010. In 2016, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops provided a very detailed historical chronicle of how various popes over the centuries have repudiated the teaching of the Borgia Pope and have celebrated the teaching of Paul III and reaffirmed it over the centuries. So if we get caught up with a specific notion and it becomes an idée fixe, so we become obsessed about it, and don't consider the subsequent historical nuancing and whatever, I think we still find ourselves in an orbit of contestation that is not going to be helpful in terms of the larger healing. So I worry a bit about the fact that there are expectations for healing that are going to be focused on the Bishop of Rome, rather than on the fact that this is a Canadian problem. And not a uniquely and only Canadian problem. It's a problem that many of the New World countries, including Australia and New Zealand and others as well, in terms of how they dealt with their Indigenous peoples. Yeah. So it is that kind of universal problem. but to put it within a limited, constrictive, and not exactly accurate historical perspective, so that the repudiation of the doctrine is done. I mean, Pope Francis said again on the trip, in the conversation, because he's a pope that loves to move beyond the script, as we discovered on many occasions, that when he was asked about whether this was in fact genocide, said it was genocide, and he used, it presumably was his English translation from the Spanish, be calm, you can be calm about this. I recognize this as genocide. And then when addressed on the matter of the doctrine of discovery, though he didn't repeat the phrase, what he said is we must repudiate this mentality of colonization. So I just wonder about whether we're going to find ourselves in a position of institutional paralysis by having expectations that can't be delivered on, precisely because it's just simply more complicated and nuanced than we expect. And we're talking about a global institution. When you go to Rome, and many representatives, indigenous representatives were in Rome, and I'm sure they were quite taken aback by not only just its splendor, but by the magnitude of its trajectories and connections and tentacles with religious orders and religious communities, ecclesial communities, other governments and whatnot. What we received from Pope Francis, and you said this in the opening comments, in relation to the grace of the indigenous peoples, was the grace of this Pope. And I hope that becomes a marker on the pathway forward. I share to some degree Melissa's anxiety that it's been a couple of weeks and we haven't heard. Well, they have. There have been several conversations in Rome. The Pope's addressed it in various ways. This has to be the Canadian Church's issue. Yeah. This is an issue for the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. They are the primary leaders on this brief. And then because there are a lot of lay Catholics in this country who are as anxious and as angry as many of our Indigenous residential school survivors, expecting leadership on this matter. Jockeying it and putting it off to Rome, that's not the right way forward, I think.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Melissa, last thoughts?
There are always two things that I ask myself when it comes to Indigenous issues. What can I change today in my lifetime? What kind of change can I see in the next 10 or 20 years? The second thing I always ask myself is, how will this benefit Indigenous communities? You know, are we asking for something tangible that is genuinely going to help survivors? So it's always these two things that I go in with. It's always these two questions that I ask. And if it's something that seems out of my lifetime, something that may never happen, then that's not my battle. I'm looking at what we can do today, how we can help survivors, and that's the only way that I will, move forward on issues. And that's where and when I question things, and just having that mentality, I can help people today. I'm not looking 80 years down the road. I want to help people today and now.
You're a lovely, pragmatic person, Melissa. I love the spirit. Chief, the last word to you. What are your last thoughts on this topic?
Thanks, everybody. Reconciliation is a means to an end, and we are going to get there. How fast we get there depends on our actions and attitudes, and belief and understanding that we inherited this. And the Pope's visit has come and gone. And so now today, as Canadians, we're still here, and we're still going to be here in 10 years. We're still going to be here in 20 years. So let's make action today, and our kids one day will look back and say, they really did make action at that time that made it easier for us today. Or we can give it to them and they could inherit it. I don't want to give it to them. So as Canadians, as Indigenous people, let's just grab the whatever situation we're at, own it, and let's do something about it.
Well, listen, Chief, wonderful thoughts to conclude our conversations. The second of our webinars on dealing with the Pope's visit. I guess what I'm taking from all of you in all of this conversation is really interesting. That in fact, let's not focus on what the Pope does. Let's focus on what we do. And the we, partly for the Catholic Church, the we is the Canadian Council of Bishops. There's no question. It's Indigenous communities themselves. It's non-Indigenous people and how they react to all of this. I think what my view basically is the Pope's visit laid bare some things that we knew about Canada but didn't want to say out loud. And I don't mean First Nations talked about it a lot, academics have talked about it a lot, but the public at large has been reluctant to use language of genocide. And even the Doctrine of Discovery comment that was interesting, the nuances of the church are there, and their comments about Doctrine of Discovery. A lot of people still tell me about this. Well, we came over and discovered Indigenous people, and you sort of say, well, they weren't lost. You didn't discover them. They were here and they've been here forever. So I think the message we take from all of this is a really important one. And that is that the Pope's visit, the Pope doesn't tell us what to do, unless you're a Catholic, I guess, Michael. But the Pope sort of gives direction to the church as an institution. And there's some powerful messages there. The question, as Melissa points out, is, will we pick up this mantle? Will we actually sort of take advantage of the public notoriety that surrounds these issues right now and do what Chief DeLorme is talking about? Indigenous communities in this country are already in the middle of a revolution. Michael, with great respect, and I love your knowledge of the church, the Catholic Church is lagging behind Indigenous communities in their response to the challenges that they're facing. And I think it's fair to say they're not waiting for the Catholic Church to do all the things it should do. The Catholic Church has an opportunity to be a partner with Indigenous communities in the future, and I hope they embrace that. But I also hope that we find a way to look for those positive, constructive changes that Melissa and the Chief were talking about. They're occurring. There's far more of them than we know. We love to focus on conflict, not achievement. We love to focus on crisis rather than reconciliation and the rebirth and revitalization of culture. The three of you have been wonderful, wonderful colleagues and friends again on this call. This has been a fabulous webinar. Melissa Mbarki, Michael Higgins, Chief Cadmus DeLorme, thank you very much for participating. And thanks to all our audience members for listening in on what was another wonderful conversation about the Pope's visit. Thank you, everybody, and farewell.
Thank you, Ken.